Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning, and you are watching Sunday School Apologetics. And today we are asking the question, is there really a contradiction in the list of names of Jesus' 12 disciples? And before we get into the topic at hand, here is a quote from the famous, now deceased atheist, Christopher Hitchens, very outspoken atheist. He said that the New Testament is a work of crude carpentry, hammered together long after its purported events and full of improvised attempts to make things come out right. Well, one example of this alleged crude carpentry is the fact that the names of the 12 don't match in the Gospels. And so Matthew 12:4, it lists Simon, Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, John his brother, Philip Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him, right? Well, in Luke's gospel, instead of Thaddeus, we have a guy by the name of Judas, the son of James. And so there's a discrepancy there. They couldn't seem to get this fact right. Here is a Catholic New Testament scholar who says that the names of the 12 were no longer accurately preserved in the early church by the time that Luke and Matthew were writing. And the group of the 12, though important from the outset, gradually lost its significance, even to the extent that people no longer could recall who once constituted the 12. They were like, well, we know it's these guys, and what's his name again? I can't remember. We'll just throw a name in there. That's basically what he seems to think has happened. And so how could they get something this important so wrong if they were really up close and had access to eyewitnesses? Well, there is a proposed solution that has been given out throughout the century, and that would be Thaddeus and Judas could be the same person, right? That doesn't seem totally impossible, does it? Or does that really reek of harmonization? Well, I don't think it does reek of harmonization, because if you think about it, people had multiple names during that time. And we'll get into a minute here why the names in the Gospels are actually good evidence that they were written by eyewitnesses or people who had access to eyewitnesses. Take a look here, though. Simon was named Cephas and also Peter. Cephas is the Aramaic version of Peter, but Simon, Cephas, and Peter are all the same person. So that's three different names. In Acts 1:23, we read about a disciple that his name was Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus. Well, now he's got three different names. Acts 15:22 says there was a Judas who also was called Barsabbas. And Barnabas' real name was Joseph. Barnabas was obviously famous for traveling with Paul at one point. And so, how do we tell a Judas from a Judas? Now, noted New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham looked at sources including Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, early rabbinic texts, and ossuaries, in other words, bone boxes, from 330 BC to 200 AD. And most of his data came from 50 BC to 135 AD, or basically around the time of Jesus. For Jews in Palestine, Bauckham found 2,953 occurrences of 521 names, comprising of 625 occurrences of 447 male names, and then there was less occurrences of female names, 328 occurrences and 74 female names. And in this research, and you're going to see why this is relevant in just a moment, he found that the most popular names in Palestine are listed right here. You got Simon, Joseph, Eleazar or Lazarus, Judah or Judas, Yohanan, which is also the same as John, and Joshua or Yeshua, or as we know, Jesus. Those were the most popular Jewish names in Palestine, according to Bauckham's book, and you can see that it's in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is a very excellent book on the Gospels. I don't agree with all of Bauckham's conclusions in it, but it is a good book, and I highly recommend it, and I will put a link to the book in the description down below. Now, how does the Gospels and Acts correlate with the research that Bauckham did? Well, the men with the two most popular names, Simon or Joseph, correlates very well. 15.6% to 18%. Men with the 9 most popular names, again, correlates really well. There is a little bit of a differences with the women's names, but we know that we're dealing with a small sample there. Now, compare this to the frequency of particular Jewish names in Egypt versus Palestine. This is again in Baucham's book. And Eleazar is the most popular name, still popular in Palestine. But another really popular name is Sabbathias. If you're looking to name a boy, maybe your wife's pregnant, or you're a woman watching this and you're pregnant, hey, how about Sabbathias? Great name there. Very popular in Egypt during that time. But obviously it wasn't as popular in Palestine. Joseph, popular in Egypt, popular in Palestine. Dositheus, not as popular in Palestine, but definitely popular in Egypt. Pappus, tied for 4th. Not nearly as popular in Palestine. Ptolemaeus, not as popular, but very popular in Egypt. And Samuel, sort of popular in Judea, but definitely much more popular in Egypt. Now, Peter Williams tells us, and he's done some additional research in this book, and I will link his book, Can We Trust the Gospels, for which I'm drawing a lot of this material from both Williams and Baucham. And I'm going to link it in the description. But whether we look at Jews in Libya or Western Turkey, their patterns were quite different from those in Palestine. Rome had many Jews, but unlike those in Palestine, their names were mainly Greek or Latin, with only a tiny fraction being Hebrew or Aramaic. And so he goes on to say, someone living in another part of the Roman Empire would simply not be able to think of Jewish names familiar to them and put them into a story, resulting in a plausible group of names for Palestinian Jews. And so we're going to get back to Judas and Thaddeus and whether there's a contradiction, but I want to emphasize that this is really interesting, that if somebody was writing the Gospels in Rome or somewhere else in like Asia Minor or something like that, it would have been very difficult to get this correlation of names that we see in the Gospels that correlates with Baucham's studies from looking at all these different sources. And so, according to Baucham, the way that you tell a Judas from a Judas, or a Jesus from a Jesus, or people that share a lot of these popular names, is they would have disambiguators. In other words, they would go by nicknames, or they would have like an additional name at the end of their name, like Jesus of Nazareth, right? He's from Nazareth, so that's what we're going to call him. Or Judas Iscariot, which just means man of Kerioth, which is a city, and so they're identifying the other Judas with his city. Or Simon of Cyrene, the man who helped Jesus carry his cross. That's a very, very popular name, Simon, as we showed earlier. And so, in a way to disambiguate one Simon from the other, it's Simon of Cyrene. Or you could be disambiguated by your father's name. Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus. Bartholomew means son of Ptolemy. Or you could, have a disambiguator by your occupation, like Matthew the tax collector. Or a Greek name like Joseph, who is also called Justus. Now, regarding a Greek name, here's Baucham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. In this case, the possibility that the same individual bore both names is well supported by what we know of names in Jewish Palestine in this period. The name Thaddeus is an example of a Greek name. It could be Theodosius, Theodotos, Theodoros, I hope I got those right, which has first been turned into a Semitic shortened version today and has been Grecized or Grecized. I hope I'm getting this right. Oh well, let me know in the comments how bad my English is here. But anyways, it would have been Greekified, we'll just put it that way. Again, is Tadiaus. I'm not going to read all that. You guys can read that. I'm just going to butcher these names. But the point that Baucham is making here is that Thaddeus is a Greek name, and he could have went by Thaddeus to avoid some confusion, so that when Jesus or Peter said, "Hey, Judas," you didn't have two guys turning around and looking at you every time. They probably went by a different name. Also, there is another reason why Thaddeus could have gone by Thaddeus instead of Judas, is the bad association with Judas the traitor. We already saw earlier in Acts there was another Judas who went by a different name. And if you say, hey, I'm one of Jesus's disciples, which one? Judas. Oh, I thought he killed himself. Like bad association there. So it may be very plausible that he'd want to go by a different name, just for the same reason that nobody really in Germany anymore names their baby Adolf. After World War II, it became a very unpopular name. And according to an article in The Independent, Adolf was a common name before World War II. Adidas, the sportswear company, is named after its founder, Adolf Dassler, who went by Addy, who was born in 1900. The real name of Harpo Marx of the Marx brothers was originally Adolf, though he changed it to Arthur before the rise of Hitler. The majority of Adolfs still living in Germany are elderly and were named before the end of World War II. The name has become rare since then. Official records show that only 13 children were named Adolf between 2006 and 2013. It's made a minor comeback in recent years, with 46 children named Adolf since 2013. Well, that's a very, very small amount of people compared to all the kids that are being born in Germany, at this time. It's just completely plummeted in popularity for the same reason. If you were around the Revolutionary War, you probably wouldn't name your kid Benedict for the bad association of him being a traitor. And so it just makes a lot of good sense for Judas to go by a different name. Now, how about the names serving as evidence? We've already touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to take a look at the disciple list of names, the roster, and see some of the patterns that we see from Baucham's research and how they stand out. Simon, extremely popular name. He was given a nickname, Peter. Andrew, his brother, not a popular name. No disambiguator. James, popular name, goes by the son of Zebedee. Same with John, son of Zebedee. They were also the sons of thunder, if you remember. Philip, tied for 61st, not a very popular name. No disambiguator. Bartholomew, not a popular name. No disambiguator. Thomas, there is something in John where he's also called Didymus, but not a popular name. And he does have a nickname, but you don't hear about it as often. Matthew, very popular name, also the tax collector. James, popular name, son of Alphaeus. Judas, very popular name, we've already touched on that. Simon, very popular name, again, number 1. He also was Simon the Zealot. And Judas Iscariot, which we've already talked about. And so these patterns we see immediately, according to Peter Williams here, I'm quoting him, we see immediately that the more popular names like Simon, Judas, Matthew, and James have disambiguators, or in the case of John, have clear contextual disambiguation, the name of his father. Disambiguators are used for most of the popular 11 names. On the other hand, we have names that, on Baucham's rankings, are tied for 39th or lower in frequency: Thaddeus, Bartholomew, Philip, and Thomas, which does not even make the top 39 names. None of these have disambiguators, or, as I have argued here, Thaddeus and Judas are the same guy, and his disambiguator is just going by Thaddeus instead. And so, not only are the names authentically Palestinian, but the disambiguation patterns are such as would be necessary in Palestine so as not to get confused, right? But not elsewhere. So from this, we may conclude that whoever wrote Matthew's gospel, or wherever, Matthew's gospel was written, this list itself most likely took something close to its current form in Palestine. So again, the point is that the gospel writers weren't making up stories far away from the events that they were reporting. They were familiar with the current form of Palestine and were familiar with the culture and the names. And so there's another really interesting piece of evidence that I want to point out. There's disambiguation in speech that happens. And so notice that when the gospel writers are talking about Peter, they refer to him as Peter. And they say, like for these examples here, and when they entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law sick with a fever, referring to Jesus who healed Peter's mother-in-law. Then there's also another verse where it says, Peter began to say to him, "See, we left everything and followed you." This was after the rich young ruler and that encounter and he walked away sad. And they were like, hey, he walked away sad, but we didn't. We followed you. And it says, Peter began to say. And when they kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. This is when Peter was about to say that, I don't even know Jesus. And so we see this over and over. I could multiply verses, but that would bore you to death. Just do a quick search if you have any sort of Bible study software and you can see this. But notice when people are talking to Peter, or specifically Jesus talks to Peter, he calls him Simon. An example of this, and Jesus answered him and said, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, referring to his own identity, but my Father who is in heaven. Or another example, they were asked, hey, does your master pay the temple tax? And Peter says yes. And then he came into the house, and Jesus must have known that something was going on, and he spoke to him first, saying, What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings take toll or tax, from their sons or from others? Notice again that he refers to him as Simon, not Peter, even though he gave him the nickname Peter. And then when he's praying for him that he doesn't, disown him and lose his faith, he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to have you that he might sift you as wheat. So he calls his name twice, and both times it's Simon, Simon. And so Jesus is constantly referring to him in this more intimate sense. It's kind of like if you have a name that you go by and everybody calls you that name, but when you're at home, mom and dad call you by your real name. And if they say your name twice, you know you're in trouble. And so it's just very interesting, this disambiguation that we see in speech that just matches the way real life actually is and how people talk and communicate with one another. And so this is exactly what we don't have in the apocryphal Gospels, in these second century Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas. In the Gospel of Thomas, we have James, Jesus, Mary, Matthew, Salome, Simon Peter, and Thomas named. Well, we know that those are names that fit the pattern of Israel, but it's only a handful. It's not as many. Now, in the apocryphal Gospel of Mary, another second century work, we got Andrew, Levi, Mary, which is a very popular name, the most popular, that and Salome for women. And we have Peter, no mention of a Simon there, and the Savior. They don't even call Jesus Jesus. He's just referred to as the Savior. And he doesn't disambiguate Mary. But in the Gospels, we see there's Mary Magdalene, and there is all of these other Marys that are disambiguated all the time. It's just over and over. We see these Mary, the mother of Jesus, different disambiguators to distinguish, right? And then the Gospel of Judas. Well, we have Judas and Jesus and a bunch of weird people from outer space, like Barbelo and strange names that are listed in Judas's very strange and Gnostic gospel. And so, for these reasons, Peter Williams says, by far the simplest explanation is that the gospel authors were able to give an authentic pattern of names in the narrative because they were reliably reporting what people were actually called. And he says, given that names are hard to remember, the authentic pattern of names in the Gospels suggests that their testimony is of a high quality. After all, if they correctly remembered less memorable details, names of individuals, then they should have had no more difficulty in remembering the more memorable outline of events. Now think about it for just a second. I've been going to the same church for 18 years. It's only 200 people. I don't remember everybody's name there yet. I also used to work at my church's after-school program, and we worked with anywhere from 50 to 70 elementary age kids. It took me 6 months to finally be able to know most of those kids' names. And I was in charge of marking those kids' names out. And sometimes I'd have to look at another teacher and go, I forgot that kid's name. What's his name again? I don't know who's leaving, and I need to mark their name out. And so names are hard to remember. If you're ever at a party and you shake hands and meet somebody, chances are when you go home the next day, you're going to remember what that person was wearing. You're going to remember details in your conversation with that person. You might even remember what they do for a living. But you're not going to remember that their name was Josh until somebody says, oh, yeah, Josh, that's who you were talking to. So names are hard to remember. And so if they could get these details that are hard to remember right, then it's not a difficult inference to say that they were remembering other more notable events, like when miracles and different things like that happened. And so here's what we have in conclusion. There is no contradictions in the names of the disciples. There's an apparent discrepancy that is easily resolved and is very plausible given what we know about the patterns of names. And that the names actually provide very good evidence that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. And so I hope this video was helpful. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to share this video if you found it to be something that was beneficial to you. You can also support me monthly on Patreon. Anything that you can give goes a long way in support in order to make more quality videos and cover some of my costs for the website, which is listed right there, is JesusAlive.com. You can also find my Facebook page and Twitter. I will put that in the description. And thank you so much for watching.